Okay, welcome everyone. We're so happy to see so many folks here for the Spring Translational Network meeting of the Zero to Thrive Translational Network. My name's Allison Miller. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be giving just some intro remarks and talk about the, sure, that's fine, Kate. Kate is operating my slides today, so
all right.
Any technical difficulties? Just say a few words about the Translational Network. We're a group that really strives to bring together, and I think today hopefully will be a wonderful example of this, people working in lots of different sectors and lots of different areas on behalf of the well-being of young children and families who are facing adversity. The Translational Network has really worked to bring together faculty across lots of different units of U of M to find these sort of real world solutions. And a really critical component of that is connecting with community partners who we will be hearing from today. Next slide, please. Oh, you know what? Sorry. I'd like to just also acknowledge the faces on the top of this slide are the steering committee for the Translational Network. And so we've really worked together to pull together the talks for today and the talks from last time, which I'll reflect on a little bit in a minute. So thank you to everyone in the steering committee. Next slide. Here we are, the opening remarks. I'm the chair of the steering committee for the Translational Network. Kate Rosenblum, who's the Zero to Thrive co-director, will be giving some opening remarks as well and introduce our speakers for today. Then we'll hear from speakers representing different community organizations. Unfortunately, one of our speakers is having a bigger technical issue, and Ilan Jaffrard may not be able to make it today as a speaker, so we may have some more time for discussion, but hopefully she can make it. We will also have question and answers and discussion. So we do ask that people post their questions in the chat, and we will monitor the chat and then have a guided discussion after all of the talks. That discussion will be moderated by Patricia Protowski, who's here representing the Mishar Community Engagement Program from U of M. And then we will we'll wrap up and talk about next steps. Next slide, please. So just to reflect a little bit on where we've been so far, this fall, we had a series of talks that some of you may have attended or heard about or seen the summary for. I think we're also posting a link to the summary report in the chat. We focused on the idea of what do we do now that we're post-election? What kind of policy areas can we think about that can enhance the well-being of young children and their families? So we heard from speakers who are pictured here about early childhood education policy approaches. We heard about the well-being of migrant and farm worker families in Michigan. We heard about maternal mental health and policies around that, and then sort of a broad overview of the state of child welfare and relevant policies for the state of Michigan. So if you guys haven't checked out those talks, they're recorded and on the Zero to Thrive website, and there is a summary report that has sort of information about each of these talks. So today, what we're hoping to do is hear from, like I said, the community partners around what do we do now that we're 100 days out, and what can we think about in terms of policies that are relevant for the well-being and welfare of young children and their families. So I think this is the next slide, Kate, I think maybe you. So now Kate Rosenblum will say a few words about today's talk.
Sorry for that interruption. But thanks, Allison. And it's really wonderful to have all of you here with us today. I wanted to welcome you and to welcome our speakers and to share just a little bit about each of them. And then what I'll do is I'll let you know who will be presenting today very briefly. And then as we go through each of the presentations, I'll be pasting a fuller bio paragraph that they've each provided into the chat so that you can learn a little bit more about their background and work more broadly. So I just want to sort of introduce those of you who are not familiar with Zero to Thrive. Zero to Thrive is a program at the University of Michigan that is focused on promoting the health, well-being, resilience of families from pregnancy through early childhood, through research, service, and community partnership. And so our vision for families is that all families from pregnancy through early childhood have the well-being and resources that they need to achieve their full potential. We are just delighted today to be able to have community partners in this work and in achieving this vision for families and for communities. And I'll tell you a little bit about who will be here with us today. So I will start with Alon Joshbard, who unfortunately may or may not be able to make it with us today, but nonetheless, I will let you know that she is a certified birth doula through Dona International, a certified lactation counselor and childbirth educator. And she shares that she finds her greatest joys in supporting her community as a village auntie, serving families as they transition into parenthood and advocating for the inherent right for all families to experience holistic, quality, and respectful care during, after pregnancy and birth. And she's also a doula with the Michigan Prison Doula Initiative. So I'm really hoping the technical difficulties will work themselves out and she'll be able to join us in a little while. Don Kuchniki is entering his 11th year as Telemann Corporation's Director of Community Programs, and he has oversight responsibility for the Head Start, Workforce and Career Services, and Housing and Financial Empowerment lines of business. He's responsible for constructing grant-supported plans and for the deployment of staff in Michigan's service delivery area. Under his leadership, Telemann Corporation was acknowledged as the Community Economic Development Association of Michigan's Economic Development Leader of the Year award in 2020. Woohoo, that's great. He's also the host and creator of a podcast, A Passion to Serve, where he interviews people who have dedicated their professional lives to serving migrant and seasonal farm workers and other underserved populations. Julie Lumeng is with us. She's the Thomas P. Borders Research Professor of Child Development Behavior, Professor of Pediatrics, and Professor of Nutritional Sciences. She's also the Associate Dean for Clinical Research at the Medical School, Assistant Vice President for Human Subjects Research at the University, and Executive Director of the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research. Natasha Pilkauskas is an assistant professor of public policy at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. And importantly, you've seen her picture before because on a previous slide, we indicated that she's also a member of our Zero to Thrive Translational Network Steering Committee. So we're delighted to have her present to us today. Patricia Pikowski, Pachowski is the Administrative Program Director of the Community Engagement Program at the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research at U of M, known as MICHAR. She works towards building equitable partnerships between community and academic partners in research. And then Kenyatta Stevens is with us today. She is the CEO of Black Family Development, Inc. Black Family Development, Inc. is a comprehensive nonprofit family counseling agency created in 1978 by the Detroit chapter of the National Association of Black Social Workers, committed to equity and supporting families throughout the lifespan. She also has 27 years of human service experience and has provided leadership at the local, state, and international levels. She serves as a 2019 gubernatorial appointee for the Early Childhood Investment Corporation Board of Directors. And additionally, for the last 11 years, she's served 3 governors on the Michigan Committee on Juvenile Justice as a subject matter expert. So that took a little while, and that's the short version. I think you'll appreciate that we have some really wonderful, accomplished, and I'm sure inspiring presenters today. And I'm eager to sort of hear what they have to say, welcoming all of you to please share questions in the chat. We're very grateful to have Trish agreed to facilitate a Q&A discussion at the end today, and we really want to make sure that your questions are noted. So please do hold those questions, but share them with us so that we can make sure that they're noted. And I think without further ado, what I will do is hand the mic over to Natasha Pekauskas, who's going to be presenting today on the Recovery Act from a policy perspective. So I think this is a wonderful foundation for us to be inspired and think about possibility.
Okay, can everybody see? We're good? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for being here today. I am going to be talking about the American Rescue Plan, trying to give us kind of a bird's eye view before we're sort of thinking about what's been going on at the federal level with public policies around children. And then, you know, we can get into the much more nitty-gritty details with other folks who are actually doing this on the ground. So as many of you, I'm sure all of you know, that the American Rescue Plan was signed into law in March. Maybe you're asking yourself, what's the big deal? Why are we talking about this? Why is she presenting on this? Well, there are so many policies in this bill for those of us who are social policy wonks to get really excited about and that are really aiming to help children. People have likened this to sort of like being a historic plan akin to the Social Security Act, which, you know, also implemented a lot of the social policies that we still have in place today back in the 30s. So there's a lot of attention that you may have seen in the news around the child tax credit, and I'm also going to get really excited about that. But I also want to make sure that we cover some of the other policies that were in this plan. So to begin, or this bill, I should say, we're going to talk about health. So there's a number of different things that the bill has in it around maternal and child health. So there was funding for pediatric mental health care access. There was funding for early intervention services through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There was funding for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And there was also a provision that was put in place for states to take the option to extend Medicaid or CHIP for folks who were postpartum. So right now it goes for 60 days after they give birth, they get kicked off, but now states have the option to keep people on for up until 12 months after birth. Which is, you know, kind of an exciting policy piece. There's also more funding for child abuse and prevention, as well as through nurse home visiting. So lots of buckets of money for different maternal and child health pieces. Now, there also is quite a bit of money around adult health. I realize adults are not children, which is the focus of today, but you know, they have adults in their lives. And so that's also important. So there's a number of things around that in terms of getting, especially trying to make healthcare more affordable. So through tax credits, as well as through the Affordable Care Act and the plans that are offered, making them less expensive. And then there were also some incentives put into this bill to try and help the states that did not take the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act to do so. There are also, besides health, there's a lot of tax credits. I study tax credits. I realize they're kind of boring, but they're really, really big and important. So the most important one is the child tax credit. So what they've done in this bill is they've changed the child tax credit to make it a fully refundable credit. So really we should rename this because it's not really a tax credit anymore. It's actually become like a child allowance, or we call a child benefit, which we have in lots of European countries as well as Canada. So what does this mean, fully refundable? So in typical situations where we talk about a refundable tax credit, you have tax liabilities, you owe the government some taxes, you take a credit, it reduces how much you owe. If it's refundable, even if you have zero, you don't owe anything, you can actually get money back. And so what they've done is they've made the tax credit fully refundable. There used to be a formula that made it quite complicated, meaning that people wouldn't normally get the full refund. So they've changed that. The other thing that they have done is they have also removed the earnings requirement, which is really, really big. So this is the only credit in all of our credits in the United States that actually doesn't require you to work. So if you basically, if you have a child, you're eligible to get money. And this, for those of you who are service providers, this is huge. Make sure that all of your folks know that they're going to be eligible for this. So what is it going to do? It gives $300 per month per child between the ages of 0 to 5, and then $250 a month for older children. Why is it bigger for younger kids? Poverty is much more common. There are higher rates of poverty in early childhood in particular, and we know income really matters in early childhood in particular. So lots of exciting stuff around this. In fact, it's so exciting I have a second slide on this. They also extended the refundability of this credit up the income distribution. So basically it's fully refundable up to $112,000 for a single person, or for $150,000 if you're married, and then it starts phasing out. And so the estimate suggests that 90% of kids are going to benefit from this, and the estimate suggests that poverty among children should be reduced in half. I mean, for those of the poverty nerds are like, we're all losing our minds about this because it's really a big deal. So if this could really help a lot of children be lifted out of poverty. And you can see it's not distributed equally across different racial ethnic groups. Black children and Hispanic children should be helped even more by this credit, but white and Asian children will also be helped. There's another tax credit that they put in this bill called the Child Independent Care Tax Credit. So this has already existed as well for a while, but it was never refundable in the past. They made it refundable and they've made it much more generous. So the maximum used to be $2,000. Now the maximum is $8,000 if you have 2 dependents. What does this mean? Basically, you can claim this credit if you have childcare costs, so if you don't have childcare costs, you can't claim this, but it's actually because they actually changed the phase out setting from $15,000 to $125,000. Many, many, many more families are going to be able to claim this credit than they could in the past. So we actually don't really know what it's going to do around poverty and helping, but it should help a lot of folks pay for childcare. And then the last credit I'm going to talk about is the expanded childless earned income tax credit. So what they did with this credit is they tripled it in size from $500 to $1,500. They allowed people with higher incomes to claim it up to $21,000. Estimates suggest about 17 million working adults will benefit from this. That's a lot of people. That's a lot more than kids will actually benefit from the child tax credit. Now, you may be saying, this isn't a kid policy, and you're right, but it is people who don't have a dependent to claim, right? So the way the earned income tax credit works is you have to have the child living with you to typically claim the credit. And so the people who are non-resident parents can't actually don't get much money. So this could potentially actually help a lot of non-custodial parents, and hopefully will have spillover effects on kids. And then lastly, there's a tax credit for employers to provide paid sick and family leave. Okay, there's a few other basic needs in this bill that are also addressed, things like childcare, which a lot of people probably on this call care a lot about, early education. So there was $15 billion put towards childcare and development block grant. There was $24 billion to state grants to help stabilize the childcare industry, which, as we all know, in the pandemic has been really, it's been pretty challenging. And then there was $1 billion put towards Head Start and early Head Start. There's also some money for food assistance. So SNAP or food stamps, they were extended actually in January. They were made more generous, and this bill was extended all the way through till September. The pandemic EBT, which is where families get a little bit of extra money if their children were eligible for school lunch or school breakfast. They get a top up through their food stamps if they are on food stamps, or just in general if they're not. So that was also put into this bill. And then WIC vouchers were also increased a little bit in generosity, although it's optional, it's up to the state. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about housing. Now, again, housing is not a child policy, but if you don't have secure housing, it's a really big deal if you're a child, right? Housing instability is not good. So there's a lot of money in this bill actually addressing housing in a variety of ways. So there's money for emergency rental assistance, housing vouchers, homelessness assistance, mortgage assistance. They also put more money into LIHEAP, which is the low-income home energy assistance program, as well as even some money for child homeless services through the education system. There's more in this bill, and I'm only highlighting the things that I think are relevant to children. I spent like a day reading through the bill, and so hopefully I've saved you that time. But there's also things like unemployment insurance and stimulus checks, right? Money to families also is helpful for children as well. And so in I think maybe my last minute, I don't know, or I ran through that too fast, but I just wanted to touch on the fact that there are more things coming down the pike. Last week, Biden announced the American Families Plan. We don't know what that will look like. We don't know if it will get passed. However, if we're thinking about children and young children in particular, the bill outlines, or the plan outlines, funds for childcare access to make it more affordable, plans to extend all those tax credits I just described for 5 years, free universal preschool for 3- and 4-year-olds, which is pretty big, some sort of policy to address teacher shortages. I'm not sure exactly what that will look like. Paid leave policy. We don't have that in the United States, unlike pretty much every other country in the world. a plan for a summer EBT. So summer EBT is where children who get free or reduced lunch get some money in the summer to also buy lunch. So the idea here is it's not universally implemented. So the idea is to make it permanent and universal. And then also to extend school meal programs more broadly. And then last, I couldn't resist this, even though this isn't the right target age. There's also, discussion of putting in higher education money around community college for 2 years, Pell Grants, which help pay for school, and some additional funding to historically Black colleges and universities. And with that, I am done. I hope I didn't talk too fast.
I thought that was great. It was a whirlwind tour of lots of different policies. And thank you so much, Natasha, for boiling them down to sort of an initial way to think about them if they're, kind of beyond our scope of what we think about every day. So I think that's a great opening frame. And now we're going to hear from Julie Lumang sort of on a different sort of big picture frame in terms of what's the role of a university in kind of trying to fit into this, and how can we think about ways that big picture university initiatives that she'll talk about can fit in with the mission of Zero to Thrive and kind of our bigger mission of helping children and families facing adversity. So Julie, if you want to go ahead and pull up your slides, that would be great. Thanks.
Hey, thanks so much. Let me share my screen. Okay, so I'm just going to fly through quickly. There we go. The Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research. And so what this institute is at the university is it's part of the Ctsa mechanism. And so it's the Clinical and Translational Science Awards program. And so what that is the NIH, starting in about 2006, felt that clinical and translational research was not being facilitated efficiently enough across the nation. And so they started this new mechanism, and there are usually around 60 different institutes around the nation, generally at large universities, our peer institutions. And we are the only one in the state of Michigan. You can see that some of the other states have multiple CTSAs. We're the only one in the state of Michigan. And so we're proud to be that and feel that we have a big responsibility because of that. So the overall structure of the Ctsa and how it might be relevant to you, I'll fly through this quickly. So I'm the director of it. We have a co-director, a director for education, and a managing director. We also have our cabinet, Translational Research Council. We have an external advisory committee, and importantly, we have a community advisory board. So we do appoint members from the community to that board to give us guidance and direction on what direction we're taking with the work we're doing. We just recently created a diversity, equity, and inclusion core, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. And then what you see here in terms of these headings, everything in a box, these are all required things that the NIH requires that we do. And so this is the overall structure of the program. And so I will just fly through this quickly. And so informatics, that's essentially the computer interface to do clinical research at the University of Michigan. And so we put a lot of effort into that, into being innovative in the way we create new tools to support that work. Community and collaboration has the community engagement component, which we're lucky to have Tricia here today, who she's going to talk about that. So I won't go into further detail, but that's highly relevant here. We have a team science group where we try to facilitate team science. Translational endeavors includes an education group that promotes education programs, mentoring, and then a pilot and translational and clinical studies program where we award pilot grants to spur new work. We have a research methods group that supports biostatistics, epidemiology, and research design. And we also, regulatory knowledge and support. You cannot do research without having lots of regulations involved. And so we actually try to be innovative in how we implement regulations across the university. Hub research capacity, this is essentially how do we support research here at the University of Michigan. And there's a component called participant and clinical interactions, which is how do we support recruiting participants into research studies? But most importantly for this group, the NIH has a required component, which is integrating special populations, which we could debate the appropriateness of those vocabulary words to describe this, but essentially what they are trying to communicate is that we have an obligation to ensure that we include all communities in the research that's being done, because I think, as most of you know, there are many communities that have not been typically included in clinical and translational research, and that of course has implications for their long-term health. if you don't do research with pregnant and lactating women, you don't know how to answer any of the health problems that they present with because you don't have evidence to for any of those interventions. So children is one of the groups that the NIH calls out that they want the different CTSAs, including MISHAR, to focus on in our work and ensure that we include them. And so we have some special initiatives in that space. Network capacity, this is how does the University of Michigan interact with all of the other 60 CTSAs around the nation, with the idea being that the NIH is trying to push the US the way of Europe, in the sense that in the Netherlands, everyone is in the same medical record system. And so you can do research with huge populations, and the United States is much more splintered. And so they're trying to promote more network-based research where we're working all together to address important questions. This is an overview of the scale of services we give. So in a calendar year 2020, we provided 3,800 unique services, 2,200 different clients. There are 56,000 volunteers in our participant research registry that are raising their hand to say, I might be interested to participate in our research study. This is the breakdown of who we provide services to. You can see there's a lot of medical school service, and it's primarily because a lot of the clinical and translational research takes place in the medical school, but we are a university-wide institute, and so it is a serious obligation to be providing services across the entire campus. And so we put a lot of effort into doing outreach to make sure we reach everybody. Again, this is an overview of the different services that we provide, which I pretty much went through in the prior slide, so I won't belabor this point. We do have a website you can look at in detail if you wish, if you Google MISHAR. And then going forward in the next 5 years, so we have a couple of themes in our work that we're trying to focus on in 2022 through 2027, and that is expanding our reach statewide and embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything that we do. And the statewide reach, the purpose for expanding our work statewide is that healthcare, since the Affordable Care Act was enacted, healthcare has really become much more regionalized across the nation. And so Michigan Medicine, just like other healthcare systems around the nation, is partnering with other health systems in our state. And so now it's a regional network of care, but clinical research opportunities are not necessarily available to these other networks that we're partnering with. So you can see these are the networks across the state that Michigan Medicine now has affiliations with, but the vast majority of clinical research opportunities are right here within 50 miles of Ann Arbor. So we want to make sure we can make those available around the state for equity purposes. And then our diversity, equity, and inclusion focus is that if you look at these different indicators and what % of the population in the state of Michigan lives outside of southeastern Michigan that has these characteristics, the majority of people in the state with these characteristics is outside of our local region. And so that's another reason that we're trying to expand our work to extend across the entire state. So with that, this is a brief snapshot of the MISHAR crew. We have about 80 staff who contribute to all the work that we do, and Tricia is one of them. And I'll let her go into more detail when she talks about the community engagement core, which does really fabulous work that's probably the closest to what all of you do. But if any of you are interested in partnering with us on anything, please do reach out, because we'd be thrilled to work more with any of you. And I guess I'm supposed to take questions later, so I'll stop sharing.
Sorry, my unmute was not working, but thank you so much, Julie. And I really liked how, like I said, these are sort of these bigger picture things. And I like thinking about that idea of how can we go statewide and what are the efforts to go statewide, and how can we kind of link up what Natasha was talking about with regard to policy and these big federal policy changes with what's happening in the state of Michigan, and kind of create partnerships to kind of galvanize a lot of this work together on behalf of children and families. So thanks for that presentation, Julie. Next, we'll be hearing from Kenyatta Stevens, who is the CEO of Black Family Development, and she will be talking. We heard introduction from Kate, and I'm going to let Kenyatta go for it. But we're going to kind of switch gears and hear more about what's happening on the ground and with children and families in the state of Michigan. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison, for this opportunity, and greetings to everybody. I want to just give special acknowledgement to Dr. Nell Duke, who is a wonderful colleague in some of the Hope Starts Here work that we're working on together. In fact, some of the statistics that you'll hear are actually from the work that she shared with us in that partnership. And also want to acknowledge Kerry Patterson and just being a true mentor in the field. And so thank you for your lifelong work. So with that, as I thought about what may be a potential title and subtitle to this brief time together, I thought about the adage that you hear in cross-cultural communities, and it's a question. And the question is, how are the children? And so when I think about this presentation, my hope is to perhaps frame for you voices from the field, from the perspective of perhaps the children, but more directly even the providers who care for those beautiful children and the ECE educators on the ground and what they may be experiencing. And much of this, I think that many of you who do this work because you do have a working knowledge of some of the wage inequities that are many of us face in this community. But you also have a passion, and you see this like I do, that even in the midst of the pandemic, doors of opportunity have opened. And so we'll talk a little bit about what those opportunities are as we frame this. But I'm going to get started and sharing my slides, giving you that kind of a lens, perhaps, by which to think through what we're going to share. So I mentioned the framing of this work, and I thought one of the ways to start and offer the framing is by talking a little bit and leaving the website for folks. I know Allison has my slides as well as others, and so she can share the link. But when I think about how to frame this work, I think about Hope Starts Here, because the Hope Starts Here work that is funded by a $50 million investment between the Kresge Foundation and the Kellogg Foundation really engages us thinking about the frame, voices from the field. They intentionally engaged about 18,000 community members to think about what would early childhood education look like in its best day if we all had and shared insights into it. But what I love about this quest that and the framework that Hope Starts Here has created is that throughout the work, it's continued with this real imperative to make sure that the voices of those who are impacted are heard and that they are at the table as we think about opportunities for change. And so I share the website in that frame, and we'll move forward to talk a little bit about what we see and what the impacts are locally in the state of Michigan. I'm going to move through the next slide just to, for those of you who don't know about Hope Starts Here, the website I gave really shapes the fact that there are 6 key imperatives and 16 strategies that are really the focus of the work. And so again, at your leisure, feel free to explore more. But what I want to share is that the voices from the field really kind of tell us and shape for us opportunities that exist, and even how, as we learn more about some of the legislation that's coming down the pike, opens doors for us. So one of the voices from the field that you'll hear is parents who are sharing that not only has it been challenging prior to COVID, right? But COVID has also taken a turn, making the opportunities to work outside of the home and maintain a stable workforce even more challenging. And so obviously this slide talks about the number of parents like myself who are childcare dependent, and probably like many of you on this meeting today. But what's interesting is I want to add another dynamic that's really particularly of interest for parents of young caregivers. As a result of the pandemic, 76% of mothers and 54% of fathers with children under 10 say that childcare is one of their top 3 challenges in the midst of COVID. And for those of you who are right now participating with a child at their legs, or another one who's napping, and another child that you're homeschooling while you're doing this, you can all well relate to this. And so one of the things that colleagues like Dr. Duke and others have been able to do in this Hope Starts Here movement is hear more voices from the field. In fact, in a cross-sector approach from business owners, key stakeholders like members of DTE, childcare providers themselves who were saying, this is the time to rally around opportunities to elevate the ECE field, because everybody can relate now to how important childcare providers are. But I think these statistics, like 75% of moms, talks about why we're seeing such a drop, right, in female employment in the workforce that the Department of Labor is talking about. We also know that, again, we see this exacerbated with COVID, but just the number of children, this is saying 1 out of 4, which is essentially 25% of children in Michigan live with families below the federal poverty line. But I offer to this group, as we think about opportunities on the horizon, let's kind of peel back that onion, because United Way's ALICE numbers really tell us a different story when we think about voices from the field, and particularly in the Detroit metro community. And ALICE stands for just some research that happens nationally around United Ways, but particularly in Southeast Michigan. I'll share that data. But ALICE is an acronym that stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. It means that people who are perhaps working every day, they certainly are above the poverty line, but yet we're seeing statistics that are telling us that there's such a need for reform for the voices for the field. And the data in Detroit says 69% of Detroit households actually are not able to make income and basic needs meet. So how does that impact our early childhood precious ones? Well, in the next slide, oops, sorry, I went too far. Sorry about that. We are impacted because we see that our early childhood providers are telling us, hey, not only am I being impacted, but it's impacting the families, which means that for the voices of the field, educators are saying it's impacting my bottom line because I have a heart and a passion to do this work, but I'm not turning children away. And so voices from the field are telling us, if there's a way that I can still service these babies, even when the mommies and daddies don't have money to do that, I'm still doing it. And so while folks are dependent on childcare, it's also impacting the quality of times of care that some of our early childhood providers can provide, because the curriculums cost, now the resources cost, but yet their passion to do this work compels them to still not turn a single baby away. So what we can learn from this is that there is an estimated 13% return on investment per year per child if we can take some of these American Families Act dollars that are coming and pour them right back into the childcare providers who are loving and caring for those kids that we know make the difference in our future generation. And so that relates to the compensation for early childhood professionals. There's some awesome studies that have taken place that really link a direct correlation between the increase in quality with increase in improved wage parity for teachers in the early childhood space. And so that's important because as we talk about equity, we know that obviously a disproportionate number of women of color are those who are providing childcare services and in the resources. But we also know in the next slide, I believe it talks about just poor compensation really impacting how well providers, A, enter the field, and B, stay in the field. One of the things that's really frightening for us as a state is that most of you know we have one of the lowest childcare subsidy rates in the entire country. And so what that equates to is that the ones who are working the hardest to educate our youngest of children have some of the smallest measures of pay and reimbursement as they do this job. And so that's why this particular statistic says that nearly 67% of early childhood professionals cite pay as their top frustration, not the kids. They value what they do, but the voices of the field are telling us, hey, we need help. And so why do I see this as a potential opportunity for change? Because with the tax credit, the child care tax credit, This is a great opportunity based upon what we heard earlier. There are no earnings minimums, right? And so now we have opportunities for families not to have to make this hard decision that we hear parents are making. Should I try out early childhood education or should I have food for the rest of the week, right? And so we're hoping that with equity, that from the equity lens, that discussion changes. What I also like about this opportunity as we think about advancement, something so small, well, it's not focused on children, but when we think about the opportunity for a pause on student loan repayments, that to me resonates with time, right? Parents who are so concerned about, should I take a second job? But I know I have young ones at home. What I hear all the time is, I know I need to be focused on these conversational turns that I keep hearing about with my kid, but I can't because I'm not there until my kid's at home at night. And so the voices from the field say, hey, this is critical, but we need to open doors of opportunity for them to have options to be able to be at home. And so, yes, it impacts the babies that we have. As I bring this to a close, with the Americans Families Plan, this is exciting for me because one of the things that I think about are the young men that we have had opportunity to work with as a result of what we do in the community. And the idea of a 12-week maternity leave and the bonding that happens now and can potentially happen with kids that fosters that adult attachment, which we know is so essential to early childhood brain development. To me, that's a win, right? These are opportunities that we want to begin to showcase and how it impacts our families directly. So what does that mean for us as we carry out our collective vision? Be advocates. If there's anything you leave with today, I'm asking you to really take all of this that we're hearing and be an advocate, because we have legislators, right, who don't know that the majority of early childhood providers actually can qualify for Medicaid. And so the issue of wage parity isn't on their radar. And so be a voice and keep pushing for this. As we think about the shape of universal preschool and your advocacy, let us also be mindful of those license exempt providers and advocate that they're part of that picture as we move forward in this work. And so thank you all for your time, and continue to move forward in our collective vision to make change better. Thank you for listening to Voices from the Field.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Kenyatta. I was just struck by many things you were saying, and I really appreciate that perspective of voices in the field and also cross-sector voices from the field. So much to talk about. For those of you who are also, whose interest is piqued and want to put in specific questions into the chat for our later discussion, please do so. Just a reminder, so that we can give Tricia some ideas of how to shape our discussion at the close of our sessions today. So the next person that we'll be hearing from is Don Kuchniki, and as we heard, he's the director of the Telamon Corporation, Director of Community Programs. He'll be talking with us today about Migrant Head Start in the state of Michigan. And again, thinking about, for those of you who were on the last session, we heard a lot about the concerns of migrant families and farm worker families. So we're very excited to hear Don today. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in the meeting today. As was just mentioned, I'm the Director of Community Programs for Telamon Corporation. And I'm going to primarily talk about our Head Start program and how that relates to the population that we're providing services to. I want to give it a little bit of background information about who we are as Telamon Corporation. We are a national nonprofit. We've been in existence since 1965, and we have been providing services in the state of Michigan since 1991. And we have three primary lines of business that we administer programs for. One of them is housing and financial empowerment. It was mentioned earlier on that, you know, if you're having issues with homelessness, if you are struggling to make ends meet, it's hard to really focus in and take care of some of those other really important issues or happenings that are going on in someone's life. So financial literacy instruction, providing input and insight about what it would take to become a first-time home buyer, entrepreneurship. Those are things that we investigate and we look into and we discuss with our population that we're providing services to. We also have workforce and career services line of business where for those who are eligible, we provide employment and training services too, because once again, you really need to have that skill set in order to move forward and in often cases to break the cycle of poverty. And then finally, what I'm going to be spending the majority of my time and attention on is our Head Start line of business. We've been administering the Michigan Migrant Head Start program going back to 1991. And it was really interesting because when I graduated from college, I really didn't have any prior experience or knowledge about the ag industry or the farm worker population. And it really is, you know, the word passion has been used already, and that's very relevant to what we do because there really are some fairly significant issues that we try to address through our Head Start program. We're dealing with a population that in many instances primarily are monolingual in Spanish. They're predominantly Latino. I would say for the people who are harvesting our crops, usually on average, they normally state that around 50% more or less are undocumented workers. The average educational level for farm workers is somewhere around the 8th grade educational level is when it normally stops. And these are just some of the challenges that we have to address as we're putting forward and we're implementing our Head Start programs. That the education piece in particular is, you know, our migrant population, oftentimes they are traveling to multiple sites to harvest crops, to earn a living for themselves and for their families. So that makes a lot of stops and starts in someone's educational and academic career. So that makes it all a little bit more challenging, but it also inspires me because of the people who I'm working with and the opportunities and the challenges that we've been able to overcome is really just a privilege for me to be a part of this program. So we administer 13 Migrant Head Start programs, and we are providing services in 15 different counties. We really try to provide comprehensive services to children and to their families. And once again, that goes back to the 3 different lines of business. So that gives us an opportunity that if there are other concerns, other needs that families are requesting from us, sometimes maybe those other lines of business can step in and provide that additional support. But for anyone who works within a community organization, even a university, no one entity, no one group can do it all. So our community partnerships are absolutely critical for us to meet the needs to address some of the challenges that come up on a regular basis when we are operating our Head Start centers. We typically operate 5 days a week. During that 10-hour days is the service period that we provide, which covers most, if not all of the time that our farm workers are out there harvesting and working in the fields. So we really try to accommodate and to meet their needs to the best of our ability. And we're providing services to children who are 0 to 5 years old, and also pregnant women we provide services to as well. Once again, our farm workers predominantly are Spanish speaking, monolingual in many instances. So it's critically important that we have bilingual staff, that we have staff also who are culturally sensitive to the needs of the farm worker population. And really what my experience has been too, that when we were hiring individuals, some of our best candidates and a lot of the people who work in our Migrant Head Start centers are former farm workers themselves. So they realize the importance of this type of program and these types of services and what a difference that it can make in their lives. When it comes to messaging, you know, we've hit upon it a little bit. The prior administration during these past 4 years did a lot of damage in terms of the messaging that was going out. You know, building the wall and all the type of rhetoric that's been going on, and it's unfortunate that it's still going on now, had a real impact in how we are providing services. And it also made a huge impact on the people who were willing to come out and to access needed and necessary services. That there were a lot of people who were really concerned. It's like, I do not want to put myself at risk, other family members or friends at risk. I don't want to be identified. So we really had to work very, very hard to overcome that stigma. And I think one of the real pleasures with working with a program like this is just the reputation and the trust that we've been able to instill, that our families know when they come to us, when they communicate with us, they can trust what we're telling them. And that is so important for us to make any headway whatsoever. So as mentioned earlier, I do have a podcast. It's called A Passion to Serve, and something that I regularly communicate out because I really believe in it is so important. Our farm workers are an essential workforce. Where would we have been last year during the pandemic without our farm workers? They had to make an incredibly difficult situation. Am I going to feed my family, or am I going to stay home and try to keep them safe and not know how I'm going to pay the bills? They showed up, and they continue to show up this year, and they are meeting our needs. They're doing the work that, frankly, no one else really is willing or wanting to do. So these are some of the different locations where we are at. These are very, in most instances, we are in fairly isolated and rural communities, which makes technology a barrier to education and to services. It helps, or it makes it more challenging with internet connectivity. And that was something that we really had to face up to and address last year in particular. We made a really difficult decision in 2020. We did not open up our Migrant Head Start centers. We felt like the one fundamental question that we asked ourselves is, could we really safely open up our centers? And when we looked at all the data, when we looked at the cases, and unfortunately the positivity rate for those counties where we reside were actually higher than the state average. We didn't feel that we could safely open up the centers. So what we did is we provided virtual services, along with providing weekly care packages and accessing other types of support for our farm worker families. But those were learning experiences, learning opportunities that we are applying in this year in 2021, where we are opening our centers, but it's going to be a combination of both on-site and virtual services that we're going to be providing. And during a more typical season, our education services, it's play-based learning. We have a variety of individualized activities, and we have home visits and parent-teacher conferences. That has been looking very, very differently last year, and something that will be available this year is for each Migrant Head Start Center, we would establish Facebook groups for each individual center where there would be virtual circle time. There would be opportunities for us to connect with the different family members. We would have other educational learning materials on there available, and we would really just try to meet the families where they were at. Oftentimes we had staff that were working fairly late into the evenings and during the weekends because that was the only time that the families would be available. Family engagement, that trust, that communication that I was talking about before, which is so vital to really effectively work with the farm worker population, that we help with goal setting. We have a variety of different events that we like to put on. We normally have monthly parent meetings, and once again, it was different last year. It's going to be a little bit different this year. For example, in different areas throughout Michigan, we have farm worker appreciation events. Last year, we would have cars. It was people were staying in their cars, but we had personal protective equipment available and other kinds of resources that would really make a difference. This year, with some of our farm worker appreciation events, we're going to be providing the vaccine. And just as importantly is we will be communicating about the vaccine, separating fact from fiction. And, if you think about it, there is overall a lack of faith and trust in government services by this population. And when you're talking about medical services and taking something like a vaccine, that's a big deal. And that's something that they think very, very long and hard about what really is the value in it. So once again, we try to have the right people who come from a similar lifestyle, understand and appreciate where they are coming from, and that they can address some of those concerns that are brought up. Our parents are our experts. They are our policy council members. When we are planning on implementing policy or different types of programmings, we're going to our policy council and we are talking to them just to see, are we addressing those key areas, those key issues that really need our attention during a particular season. So they're very important to us. We provide a lot of different types of training opportunities for them about our policy, about how we function as Head Start. And we also have trainings that are provided through, for example, the National Migrant and Seasonal Head Start Association. We've had some of our our policy council members who have been board members on that with that national association. So that brings that expertise back here to Michigan on a state level, on a local level. We help our parents to assist them in attaining medical care, and that includes follow-up or long-term services that may be necessary. I think, as challenging as the past year and a half has been, I think the utilization of technology has been, and it's becoming a source of strength. Telehealth services is something that is a real viable option for us now, which is very important just based on where we are located at. That's just another very important tool in the toolbox that we have that we can now provide to this population. Nutrition, we try to provide, when we're providing meals on site, when we're providing care packages, we make sure that the food that we're providing is culturally appropriate. We provide meals and snacks based on the Child Adult Care Food Program guidelines. And once again, we have a position that's called a Family Services Specialist, and they're in ongoing communication with our families. So we really find out what is it that they need, what are they interested in, what do they like, and we also provide them with really good, the most current up-to-date information on how to keep themselves and their children well and healthy. Disability services, we want to make sure that we are providing and ensuring full inclusion of program activities to children with disabilities, and we help parents navigate that process, whether it's referral, evaluation, or IEP process. We try to help walk them through that process. And everything that I have been talking about that really has become a priority for us as well is taking a trauma-informed care approach to service delivery. That if you think of the lifestyle of the farm worker, I gave some brief examples of just some of the challenges that they face in a typical year or during a normal season. And then if you add the pandemic, you look at the social unrest and all these other different areas, it's important for us to really be fully trained and know how to respond to them in a way that's meaningful and effective. And it even goes beyond our families. It's identical and very similar to our local Head Start staff. They are making a tough decision, and we've heard that too already, that a lot of them, even in the midst of the pandemic, they were willing to show up and to work on site, to be there, to make themselves available for the families, just because they realize how important that is. When it comes to disability services and a lot of other types of resources that we access, once again, our community and agency partners are very important to us. We have a lot of memorandums of understanding that outline how we are going to work together to meet the needs of our farm workers. And we really pride ourselves on being very, we're able to pivot fairly quickly. If there's an issue that's brought up and addressed to us, we can move fairly fast and address those issues to the benefit of our families. And then transportation. We don't want kids hanging out by themselves in the migrant camps, or maybe having a sibling who's taking care of a very large group of kids. They need to be in a safe place. Our Head Start centers are a safe and educational rich environment that we really want to start our families on the path to a real successful academic career. So we have busing that's available to bring them in and to expand the access that we have to our farm workers. So I consider it honestly a real privilege to be working in this realm, to be working with the farm workers. It's such a, once again, I really didn't have any prior experience when I started working in this field initially. And there's a lot of moving pieces, some really, sometimes in moments where it feels like 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, while ultimately there's such a sense of resilience. And we're seeing the results. We have people who've been a part of our Head Start programs that come back, who've gone on to post-secondary education, who are oftentimes or sometimes coming back and working within the Head Start system itself. So we're very proud and grateful for the opportunity to provide these services to the farm worker, our essential workers.
Great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful to hear about all those services and also the challenges just facing families. Again, those of you who are on the last call, I was looking to see whether Alexis Handel, who had spoken about migrant farm workers, was here, but I don't actually think she's on the call today. But she had outlined a lot around sort of housing conditions. And Don, when you were saying, the transportation and, taking kids from wherever they are into the Head Start or early Head Start centers, my mind was kind of also wondering, how do you guys work around housing and stuff? So it'd be really fascinating to hear more about that in our discussion as well. We've been trying to figure out whether Elon can make it, and unfortunately, I don't think she will be able to. So we will have to hear from her another time. But I'm happy to transition to hear from Tricia Pachowski on behalf of MISHAR that Julie had been talking about, really representing a community engagement arm of MISHAR and activities. And so I think, again, throw the questions into the chat. And just as we're hearing from Tricia, I'll be really interested to hear everyone's thoughts on sort of how can we connect, the various constituencies on this phone call and in our general other lives to really work on behalf of kids and families. So with that, Tricia, do you want to share your slides and take it away?
Thank you. And I wanted to thank the Zero to Thrive steering committee, their leadership and staff for this conversation. It's oftentimes in academia that we don't talk about policy and advocacy. And I feel like we can sometimes make the most impact in those arenas. So I wanted to thank you for having this conversation. And I will be touching upon the speakers who came before me throughout the presentation, just to kind of make some connections to what they said and kind of the work I advocate for at MISHAR. Oh, my computer's a little slow. So today I'll talk a little bit about the services I provide and my team provides within community engagement at MISHAR, which Julie spoke about. I'll explain community engagement as an approach to research and hopefully some connections to our conversation today, and then 0 to 5. As Julie mentioned, we are a Ctsa. So what's that is a work consortium that shares best practices. So rather than reinventing wheels, we can kind of share and collaborate on the work that we're doing. And it's all to accelerate discoveries towards better health. We know it takes a long time for research to make change. And we hope through these mechanisms funded through NIH that we make it faster. As Julie said, we're here to educate, fund, connect, and support. And I think those are services, and we provide them to both community and academic partners. So it's not something that just focuses on the campuses of U of M and Flint, Dearborn, and Ann Arbor. It's really to the whole state. So if you're a community partner in Marquette, you can connect with us to say, hey, I have a research question that needs answering. I'm looking for an academic partner at the Ford School of Public Policy. Can we make connections? Because I have a question that would impact the communities that I serve. So community engagement and research, it's a mutually beneficial partnerships between academics and community partners and community organizations to develop and direct research. So that's working together. I think it goes to Don's point about parents as experts. If you want to work with your community, they're experts too. And our speakers, you can see they're experts, and the communities they work with are experts. So it's really the partnership between academics and communities together in research questions that are meaningful. We don't want to support questions that isn't relevant to a community partner. I think about what Kenyatta said, voices from the field, going to families and saying with early childhood, what's important to you? How are the kids doing right now? What are their providers saying? And that is meaningful research questions to them. That is our flyer that we don't give anymore in person, but you can download it. So as I mentioned, it ensures that research is relevant and reflective of the communities it impacts. We know when communities and academics work together in research, research is better. It's more sustainable, it's more relevant, and it's often more ethical. This is a definition of community engaged research. That's not a method of research, it's an approach that supports authentic partnership of people affiliated with or self-identified by geographic proximity, special interest, and or similar situations to address issues affecting the well-being of the community of focus. So it's definitely a broad definition, and I feel like the definition of community, it expands more and more. But we at Mishar really tried to focus on communities at the grassroots level. So some of the principles that guide community engaged research is that you make the decisions together, you learn together from each other. So it sounds like Don is an expert working with migrant families, and you would work with him and he would teach you, his academic partner, about what he's hearing, and then vice versa. Natasha's an expert on, she said tax relief. So, but she's going to be at the Ford School and she's going to share expertise with Don. Say they were a partner, they decided to partner together tomorrow with Kenyatta. It would be a three-pronged partnership, but they would learn from each other. And that the partnerships would benefit from each other. So they would share resources and expertise together, which would make the research better. So this is the spectrum that we kind of present of community engagement, being the academic research on one end, and then community-driven research on the other end. And on both those ends, they often don't partner, and they might not need partnerships because they know what they're doing and they're focused on the end result. And then in the middle is collaborative research, which can be team science or can be more community-based, which is less kind of equitable partnerships. And then really a full dose model called community-based participatory research. And that's very specific and has very specific principles where all partners are equitably involved in all aspects of the research and that they share power and control and ownership over all phases of the project. So when you develop your research question, when you disseminate the data back to the community, you're doing it all together. And as I mentioned, I think I said some of the benefits: learn from each other, your strengths and needs. You increase the relevance of research questions. You improve the likelihood of translating research findings, which I think is really critical here when we talk about policy and advocacy. For a community partner, you gain access to university resources. There might be something that the university has that isn't always accessible to everyone. You collect data and stories to improve programs and services. So I really think that's, you try to balance the qualitative and the quantitative data. You use findings to advocate for funding and policy change, which we're here today to talk about. So our program, we work to educate both community and academics on research. We fund new projects and initiatives in partnership with our pilot grant program, but sometimes we also have funding mechanisms for our program. We connect groups doing similar work, and we try to support community research studies. And so we've been doing a lot, which isn't as glamorous as, as right now in the pandemic. Our work has really tried to pivot to the needs of our communities. And so we spend a lot of time doing COVID-related research and services that I think are reflective and relevant to what we've been talking about today. And I'll just touch a little bit about some of the work we're doing, just trying to stay on time. I know we have questions already in the queue, and I'm mindful that we received some beforehand. We've been receiving some during, and I think I have questions from listening to each of you as well. But on the top of this screen, there's a map of Michigan. I think when the pandemic happened in March and April, our community partners were telling us that they're still serving communities. Their doors are still open and they don't have hand sanitizer, and they don't have relevant materials that are at an accessible reading level. And we kind of jumped at the chance to help. We had the school pharmacy producing hand sanitizer, I think over 180 gallons to date, and we started distributing it to local communities. So I think we got as far north as Clare, Michigan, just putting the hand sanitizer in our car and driving it. You'll see some of the flyers up at the top too. We made accessible flyers, both in English and Spanish. So I think it goes to some of the points our speakers were talking about, is accessibility, of making sure that we think about language. We think about reading levels and literacy levels. Also, we made flyers for youth and older adults, because we know that they learn differently and different things pique their attention. So those flyers are on our website if anyone needs them. We also did our own survey. Our Flint partners who we work with about communities in crisis from the Flint water crisis, they said, we don't know what's happening with parents. So in May, we implemented a parental perspective survey, and we've collected about 2,000 surveys to date. And that's how you take research and you can impact policy. Because we heard that parents aren't bringing kids to the doctors for just general immunizations because it's just not working with their schedules, or there's new fears. And so you can feed that to the providers or to families and saying, hey, you got to come in. I know you're scared. This is the protocols we've put in place to keep you guys safe. We also implemented a town hall with a community and a medical experts together alongside, and we have live Spanish interpretation, because we want to make sure, and it's in the evening. I think Don said, things don't happen 9 to 5 for families, and you gotta be able to pivot your services to that. If we're talking about things that can keep them safe, that can keep them healthier, then make sure they can go to those events. They might be working 9 to 5, so that doesn't work. Or in the middle, I have a new project that we started in September, funded by the NIH, for communities most affected by COVID health disparities. And, I know that some of the vaccine clinics are going to, actual living communities, right? Like mobile home units. They've heard from people, it's really hard for me to get to that Michigan Medicine Stadium, or, I don't feel comfortable with the government, and I feel like they're going to ask me for my ID. So just trying to say what we're doing in research can actually make change in policy and service. So I just changed the only thing that changed is actually that using research for policy and advocacy change. I think we can do that easily. I think we just need to be thinking about that when we're working. What can we do to advocate for communities? So I just have this as my last slide. And I think we can each do that, is just finding ways to use research to advocate with communities and work towards policy change. And I want to point out that word with. We're not working on or in or over, but really with families and communities, because we're going to make the most impact in that space. So thank you. There's my email address if anyone wants a consult or has some questions about what we support. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oh, and I see we're getting lots of questions in the queue. But I wanted to ask, I think for the speakers, just for each of you guys, hearing the other speakers talk and kind of reflecting on our work as we move through this agenda today, if each of you could talk about one issue that has arisen out of the pandemic that you are working to either change through policy or advocacy for children and their families. So I'm actually going to ask Natasha to answer that question first.
What am I working on research, sorry, can you paraphrase it really quickly again? I was listening and it just went.
It's okay. So we've been in the pandemic for 14, 15 months. And so I guess thinking about what we've been talking about today and what you've heard from the other speakers, something that's kind of happened in your work that you are trying to address through policy change. So, you mentioned the American Rescue Plan. Are you doing anything around that? And if it's just one thing that you've been working on or thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've been working on a lot of different things that are sort of pivoted and related, I hope, to policy change around sort of cash for families through a number of different studies, and thinking about how we deliver that and what works best for families. That was a pivot due to COVID, but I think a lot of my kind of work around taxes, which I know is boring, is so important. And some of the stuff that I've been doing that's not COVID related, but I think is fundamental to whether or not the child tax credit is going to work, is thinking about families and how we define a family and who is a family and who gets to have that credit and how are we going to penalize them when the wrong person claims it, and so forth. And so while I am not actually directly in those policy conversations, I have been talking with folks who are. And so this may be, again, too wonky for this group or too much in the details, but I think thinking about this, especially for people who are working with families, like there are going to be a lot of confusion and there's just a lot of complexity in using the tax system to provide benefits to families in ways that I have great concern about the extent to which they will be able to access this. So I'm in the process of trying to design a study to see if families are able to access it and how, and what are the things that they're ideally, in my mind, if this works, what are the problems that people are worried about before, like what do people, potential participants see as issues to getting this credit, right? And what are they worried about and why they might not get it? And then sort of seeing later on whether or not that changes and whether or not they're successful in getting it. So I think I answered your question.
You totally did. That was awesome. Thank you for that. Next, we'll ask Julie. And I did want to say, Julie is, as our new kind of director of MSHAR, has been thinking about even small policy, policy that we can make change within our organization and how that can really impact the communities that we serve. Julie mentioned DE&I, and Julie, you can expound upon it, but I really think, saying that there's a DE&I core and focus of MSHAR changes the whole landscape of the work we do and will bring people to the table that have been often left out of that, those conversations. So Julie, do you want to add anything just about things that we've been thinking about at MSHAR that you've been working on that we've been trying to address?
Yes. And Tricia, you're such an excellent moderator. I was going to say, so from a DE&I perspective, a lot of times the work at the university related to the research community is focused on the researchers, like the research staff, the research workforce, trying to ensure we have a pipeline of a diverse workforce. It's really interesting because there has been less of a systematic focus at the university on the research participant experience. So we actually are lacking data, in fact, on how, we have some pockets of data, but we're lacking data on what is the representation in the individuals who participate in research at the University of Michigan. Is it a broad representation across the community? Number two, and like just counts are one thing, but on a whole other level, what is the experience of those individuals? Like if someone did a qualitative interview with someone after they participated in a research study at the University of Michigan, how did they feel treated? What was their experience with it? Were the materials culturally sensitive? Were the questions that they were asked on questionnaires appropriate? Like all of those sorts of things. And then the other thing I would comment on is that I think there are, to be clear, I think that our institutional review board does a really outstanding job. Like it's recognized as a leader nationally in terms of how it functions in protecting human subjects. But I think that we have a lot of things that we could do around the IRB and human research ethics and protections that we could do an even better job. And there's a lot of enthusiasm at the IRB for thinking a lot about those issues and could we do some innovative things. So we do not have specific plans yet beyond what I described, because in the true spirit of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm not just going to make the plans. We're going to engage people to put together a task force. We're planning a retreat sometime in the fall. And so I can circle back with all of you to see if we can engage the group.
Thank you. Next, I'll ask Kenyatta to speak to the same question. I'm sure you can add a lot because you're working really and focusing on how are the children, working with the early childhood providers and families. So I'd love to hear kind of what you've been hearing through the pandemic of things to work on.
Sure. So, Tricia, I'll start with the specific question that you asked, and then if you would be gracious to allow me to answer Julie's question, I think they dovetail into one another. So the pandemic decreased the number of providers available to actually teach our children, and it decreased the number of ECE, early childhood education seats available for parents to even place their children. And so in terms of our real policy and advocacy angle, that's really, we're taking this approach in concert with partners who are working in our Hope Starts Here initiative. It's really focused on strategy 7 in the work, which is wage parity. But to dovetail with that wage parity work, we're focused on really advocating for policy and then just real on the ground university, state of Michigan, Board of Ed support for an early childhood education career ladder. Various states, various countries have them. Michigan, to my knowledge, has not had one previously, and we certainly don't have one now. But that career ladder is important to increase the number of individuals who would potentially enter into the field of early childhood education, A, as teachers, and B, stay in the field. And that wage parity is what is essential on a policy level to increase retention in the field, as well as new blood to the field. And while you may have people enter the field, you also want folks who enter the field knowing that there is a career ladder and pathway that they can travel. So it makes it worth it to launch towards higher degrees, higher exposures, higher trainings where you have, so that you have additional badges that demonstrate your competency. So I think that's the primary kind of policy work, the career ladder, wage parity, and how they work together. Then Julie had a question regarding advocacy, and given this current environment, perhaps what are some of the maybe 3 talking points or advocacy points that I would recommend based upon what we've learned? I highlighted on the first one, and that's communicate. Communicate with your legislators. Talk to them about how the absence of childcare has directly impacted you or your, your colleagues or your family members, or even your children directly. There is sometimes a void in understanding how much that has occurred. One, because for better or for worse, many of our legislators are males who may be in the phase of grandparenting, may not have had children. And so not that men don't understand, we have men who absolutely understand. It's just that we're working with a pocket of perhaps policymakers who often don't understand that directly impacted. The second thing, so first is communicate, second is educate. When I say educate, I'm talking about educate families in your sphere who need information applying for these new tax credits that are coming out. I want to point and lift up Poverty Solutions, right? It's right at U of M, right there. So it was in my slide, I just didn't articulate it, but they're doing great work. And they have some really good tools that you could direct families to, or even guide families through if they don't have access to the internet. And even if they do, they may not understand the process. So really be hands-on. And the third, so communicate, educate, and third is expose. Expose those in your network. I'm talking about new parents. I'm talking about grandparents. I'm talking about students to evidence-based practices that work. Things like Lena Start, Parents as Teachers. Lena Start has 14 talking points of things that you can do at home while you're on the bus, while you're driving your children back and forth, that increase brain development and increase literacy acquisition, even at the youngest of ages. And so there are things that we can do, and that's where I would kind of respond, hopefully, to both questions.
Thank you for that. And I'll ask Don the same question. You're last but not least. But if you could answer something, and I think you really did in your slides, touched upon a lot of the things that have added additional stress on families, on migrant families.
Well, and as the other presenters were talking, I started to get more fired up. It's like, yes, 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 because, you know, Kenyatta hit upon something that's really huge for us too, which is I'm a big proponent of, you know, career ladders, career pathways. A lot of what we do with our employment and training line of business is really all about that we really want to make sure that when we're providing assistance and trainings, that there's a job attached to it, that it's a career that's going to be more longer term. We don't want, you know, set people up for failure that way. But I also think more specifically to what we do in terms of Head Start, we have to demonstrate that we value this line of business and the important critical work that our employees are doing. And I think this would really go a long way to help us with some of the hiring issues that we run into. Not only, you know, the pay differential can be an issue. We operate Head Start programs. We're opening, and we are open for about maybe 4 to 6 months tops out of an entire year. So really, honestly, a lot of the times it's kind of a running thing where we are training people for their next career, which to a certain extent is perfectly okay, but we don't have that pipeline of people that are coming in, that new blood to come in and really making sure that we can provide the best possible care. And hiring and retaining staff really has been an ongoing issue, and it's been even more challenging during the last couple of years. So that's an area that we really are looking at, and then I'm very much a strong proponent of. In terms of advocacy, you know, one of the things that I initially thought about, you know, we're talking about the legislation and the positive impact that it's going to have on individuals. And, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the people that we're providing services to aren't, you know, they wouldn't be eligible, or they wouldn't be able to access some of that support. Last year, we had an anonymous donor provide over $1 million that we were able to provide checks in the amount of $1,000 to a little over 1,000 people, almost 1,200 people, which was a great thing. And it kept people, you know, surviving because we were able to provide that assistance. But there were too many people that were going without, and too many people that were struggling that shouldn't. And, you know, around the topic and the issue of immigration, I just feel like we have such a broken system. There's such a lack of perspective, such a lack of an understanding. And it's just really infuriating to me, because there's a certain amount of hypocrisy is what we really see here. That on the one hand, you know, when the pandemic hits and there's really a need for additional workers, they're essential workers. We need them. And they made sure that they even made a point that, you know, if our farm workers were traveling long distances, that, you know, law enforcement probably wasn't going to be as stringent about, you know, pulling people over or finding out what's going on with them, because we needed them to harvest our crops. And as soon as that issue is addressed to a certain extent, they want this population to go back into the shadows. And it's just really a shame how we set this up. There's such an imbalance and a lack of equity and a lack of, you know, this whole thing is about racial justice, you know, social justice, racial equity, that we just need to do better. So in terms of advocacy, immigration just needs a tremendous overhauling. And I just think a better sense of really what the key issues are and how can we best address those to meet everyone's needs. I think there's such a lack at times of honoring everyone's humanity, and that just really infuriates me. And that's really just a real passion point for me right now, that how do we communicate? How do we make sure that people who come from a lot of different walks of life can really fully understand what the issues are? Things are not that black and white. These are people who are struggling to get by, but yet they are critical to our economy and the support and assistance that they provide to us. So in terms of advocacy and policy work, immigration is significant to me. And then I also think, going back to my prior statement, that we need to show that we really value these positions and honor the people who are doing this important work. I apologize for getting up on my soapbox, but I couldn't help myself.
No, I thank you for that. I think we need that energy. I think too, I'm sure many of you sometimes we get tired, you know, and we need to energize each other, especially with all the pressures that we're up against. I know I had my dog barking while you were talking, Don. I was like, oh, I hope he stops barking. And then my 8-year-old has been quiet for hours. I said, I'm going to be speaking, you know, just be quiet in the background. And so we're all juggling so many things, and then we're trying to be really stoic. And I think we need that energy. So I thank you for that, and each of you for sharing your passion. I just kind of like Kenyatta to communicate, educate, expose, you know, and I think we can do that. And those 3 things, just kind of thinking about that when we start new projects, when we're in the middle of a project, when we're at the end of that project, of how we can do that in the work that we're doing. There's so many questions, and I'm trying not to overwhelm us, but I'm gonna try to tackle a couple of them. And I'm only going in order of kind of how they were received or how to try to balance them out. But Natasha, we did have a question for you in the chat. If there are any concerns about the role of the state of Michigan in accessing and actualizing any of the benefits or opportunities that you summarize, and then the role and the need for advocacy in state.
That's a great question. It's not one that I'm very well positioned to answer, to be very frank. I know that there are folks at Poverty Solutions, as a matter of fact, thanks for the call out, who have been talking about this and trying to figure out how to use the money best as it comes in to the state. I know that there are concerns about, you know, it actually getting used and going to the people that need it most. So it's certainly an issue, and there are people on it, and I am not. I tend to focus on federal level things, as you haven't noticed in sort of what I've been summarizing. So yeah, that's basically all I can say about that.
No, that's fine. And you said, I might not have the answer, but there's others that have that answer. So that's a great way to answer that question. I do want to ask Kenyatta, I think you mentioned that, and this is another question that came from the chat, that a lot of early child care providers and teachers are leaving the field. Do you have any data on that? One of our participants was asking if you had a data source for that.
Yes, there's a great data source. Actually, it's the Early Child Investment Corporation, right? It's our state arm. And so they actually do have data. I believe I saw recently there's some on their website, but I can try to get some, Tricia, for you that I have at my disposal. So unfortunately, you know, we knew that the Department of Labor has been predicting that there was going to be a decrease in or an attrition in the early childhood educator network over the past couple of 10 years. And what we found is that not only was there accuracy with the Department of Labor's prediction, but of course, then here comes COVID, right? And so now you've got a couple of things happening in terms of, again, voices from the field. We've had early childhood providers that we work with in close proximity who have said to us, I don't think I'm going to be able to open because the parents that I serve are those essential workers that Donald talked about, and they are waiters or waitresses, and they have been laid off. So the vast majority of the kids that I would normally be serving, their parents are folks in neighborhoods that have been immediately most and disproportionately impacted by the economic impacts of COVID. We also hear providers who are saying, because I have a good number of parents who are working from home or they're not working, it costs me more to open up by the time I put in some of the quality and healthcare controls necessary to go into business. Even if I get reimbursed for them, the front end payoff is too costly for me to think about reopening my doors. And so those are things that we're seeing and hearing that are contributors to the attrition from the field.
Thank you for that. I have another question sort of related to what you were talking about that came through the chat. If you've heard of how children are doing in childcare programs since more children have returned, and are there any emerging trends in their needs given the impact of the pandemic on their families and caregivers?
Good question. In fact, I was just in a conversation yesterday with somebody wherein a choice was given to families in a preschool program as to whether they would opt to return. And in this particular provider, most of those families are experiencing or are eligible for free and reduced lunch. And many of those parents, half of them, let's say half, 50% came back, brought their children back. And what was phenomenal is that the feedback that's been coming back from those parents is that it was one of the best decisions they had made, because their children needed to have social outlets. They needed opportunities to experience direct communication, face-to-face communication with same age peers, but also adults. And so we're hearing a lot of that. We're also seeing one of the aspects of our work is that we offer, again, through the support of the Kellogg Foundation, but we offer childcare scholarships in partnership with Everybody Ready. And so for families that are eligible, generally those who would not be normally eligible for the childcare subsidy, we were hearing that there was a parent who was a beneficiary of the scholarship. Their child had been with them now because the child is only 3 years old. And so, of course, most of their life being in the midst of the pandemic, they had been with them. And so she did share with us about the separation anxiety. I think that was one of the questions that was asked. And it's just because, you know, we talked about that importance of the adult attachment, right? And the conversational turns that take place. When you introduce a new variable for any of us, whether we're adults or children, it's scary. And so certainly children are adjusting to going back into a space where they're no longer at their parents' side, right? While their parents are in meetings or parents are at home just taking care of their every need as they should be. So that's been an adjustment. I think one of the values that's come out of this, in that while Donald talked about the difficulty of virtual learning spaces, we've also seen on the flip side, for those parents who do have at least access to a smartphone. In some cases, what was interesting to us, particularly after the shutdown, the statewide shutdown, is that we had parents who were joining in Parents as Teachers or Lena Start meetings, because they were saying, I've been so isolated until now that I'm at home with 1, 2, or 3 children, and I don't have an adult neighbor that I know or trust. So that idea of a virtual phone call and a virtual group chat or meeting, or an opportunity to learn more about that beautiful child at home, was actually a welcomed opportunity, which was really insightful for us.
Yeah, and Kate just put in the chat, I think, a question too that's relevant to all the speakers, but are we hearing about support that addresses emotional needs, impact of trauma on caregivers and providers? And are there ways that you are working to do this? Familiar with strategies being employed to support providers with mental and emotional health, social isolation, etc. And I don't know, Kenyatta, if you want to speak to that, and then maybe Dawn too.
That's a great question. I think I am not necessarily indirectly aware of specific funding that's targeting this area. You know, one of the things that we do as an agency is that we are a behavioral health organization. And so about almost half of our staff are actually masters and doctoral prepared therapists and provide mental health treatment and prevention services. And so one of the things that I do know is happening is that there is a national and statewide therapist shortage, right? And so for those folks who can afford services, we see it even as a Medicaid billable provider. There aren't enough therapists available to really absorb all of the kinds of treatment needs that families have. And I wish there was more that can be done about that. But I think one of the things that is important is that each of us can be a listening ear. We know that with the pandemic, the percentage and rates of suicide have increased. For children, adolescents of color, it's increased by 65% since the pandemic. And so sometimes it's actually listening and being available just to not say anything, but to literally listen and ask the questions, how are you? And we can all do that.
Thank you for that. Don, I'm wondering, I'm sure you're hearing from families, what, do you have any things, what you're hearing about supports that would help them? And, people in Head Start, sorry, I have a screaming 8-year-old in the background. Head Start providers too. I mean, they're critical. Right. We know that kids that are in Head Start, they do better than kids that aren't. And it's an amazing program. So just kind of what you're hearing around emotional and mental health needs.
So the first piece of this, when the pandemic really just kind of started up and really started to make a huge impact, is just regular check-ins. So we would have regular opportunities to connect with their families just to see how they're doing, whether they were in Michigan, whether they were still in their home state, if they were still in Florida, Texas, it didn't matter. We wanted to have that ongoing communication. We wanted to hear from them. We did a lot of surveys and conducted focus groups with our families as well, just to find out, what are your needs? What are your concerns? What's really getting to you that we can maybe provide some additional support? And we did something similar with our staff too, that we would have regular weekly check-ins. Just, it doesn't have to be all about work. It's just, how are you today? How are you doing? How is your family doing? And, just so many different variables. If you have children at home and just so many different issues that had to be addressed, that just checking in and making sure that everyone was okay, and creating an environment where people would feel a little bit more honest, or they felt like it was a safe place where they could speak up and let people really know how they were doing. Part of the services that we do provide to our families, we contract out with different mental health consultants, and we definitely increase the budgeted allotment for mental health services for our families and for our staff, just so they could take advantage of that as well, that they had people in place that could maybe address more effectively some of the real issues that have been coming up. Because I do think that there is definitely an impact, or there has been an impact with everything that we've been going through. My executive director, Susanna Roscoe, has been fantastic with her response to this too, where regularly communicating that, for our Telemun employees, there's the employee assistance. Please take advantage of that. There's a lot of good services, a lot of good resources we can put together, even like group chats, group counseling sessions, anything like that, just to keep that connection open so people don't feel so isolated and alone. So that really, that has been ongoing, and it continues to be ongoing. We continue to utilize, direct communication, surveys, focus groups, just so we really know how things are going for our families and our staff.
Thank you for that. I'm actually going to ask Julie a similar question, because I know we have participants here that are from academia, and from a leadership perspective, what can leaders in academia or other large kind of institutes do to support their staff kind of where they're at, realizing that some don't have children at home, or some have older adults that they're caring for, and just kind of that we know that families are dynamic and they look very different.
Yeah, I would comment, there was a report coming out of actually Microsoft this morning that was getting circulated around, that they had done an analysis of work patterns and which groups were most affected by the pandemic, and who was feeling better about their work in the pandemic versus who was feeling worse. And the pattern is what you might expect, that the higher up in leadership you were, the better you felt about your work at the pandemic. And younger people, and millennials in particular, felt worse about this work environment in the pandemic. And of course, women felt worse about it. And so I think it raised a lot of questions about what should things look like going forward in terms of, hybrid and all of that. I think that the biggest issue is that, and this is where it gets a little tricky, right? Because I am bound to what the state says and what the university says, but within the guardrails of what is possible, my personal perspective is that, you know, women and others who are particularly impacted by the pandemic have so much to offer the world and the workplace and life. I often say to people, like, people talk about like work-life balance and trying to balance your work life day to day or week to week, but it's really across eras of one's life. Like, that's what I tell people, that, you know, there are going to be eras of your life that you can dedicate so much to work. And then there are eras of your life that you just can't. And I just think so many of us are in an era right now where it's okay just not to dedicate so much to work. You dedicated a heck of a lot over the past, and now it's okay just to slow down a little bit. So as much as I can message that to people, I try to do that. And just to have flexibility, I guess, to promote everyone feeling, providing support to their work colleagues and being as flexible as possible.
Just want to chime in real quickly too. It's been a real adjustment for some people, and it's been a struggle that, you know, in some ways it's nice if you can work remotely, but the work is always there. So it's really hard, I think, at times to get away from the work, that you always feel like there's more that can be done. And the amount of meetings that are ongoing and everything, I don't know, that's been a real ongoing concern and a real challenge. How do you find that balance? Because there's always more that can be done, and it's always right there waiting for you.
In that Microsoft report, they actually can look at data about usage of Microsoft Teams and how it has changed over the pre-pandemic and in the pandemic. And I forget exactly, and there were differences across groups, but it was like increasing like 60% to 100 and some percent. And it did correlate with satisfaction. I can't remember the details now, but yeah, I agree that trying to sort out how can we live in a work environment, like, we know it's not going to go back to the way it was before. And so how can we promote wellness in a new, what may be for a lot of people, a hybrid environment? And I think we're just going to have to see how it's all a grand experiment. But I think, you know, it's been a shock to the system, and we'll see how we come out on the other end. But as they all say, after the plague came the Renaissance. And so we are entering the Renaissance soon, right?
Thank you. Thank you for that. And if you have the link to that Microsoft report, you could put it in the chat for us to read. I'm going to pass it back to Kate to talk about next steps.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank the presenters. I want to thank you, Tricia, for facilitating a really wonderful discussion. That's a real art form, and I'm just grateful that you offered that and led that process. And I want to say a couple of things. Just the presentations were so rich, and I'm so glad it's recorded and that we're going to distribute executive summaries and post this, and that we'll have time to continue to process, to think, and potentially to reach out, connect, and collaborate in ways to achieve some of the goals and the aspirations that you've set forth for us, that I think are going to really help. I know certainly I can speak for myself and for Zero to Thrive, that we'll really be taking to heart what we've been learning today. And the questions that I'm leaving with are, you know, how are the children, how are the caregivers, how are the providers, and how are the communities? And while I hold hope for Renaissance, I'm also mindful of a JAM article that spoke to the fact that about 30 to 40,000 children lost a parent, that communities are grieving, that there's real lasting impacts, and that our work is, you know, there's a great need to move forward with recognition that this is ongoing. And so I think we hold the hope, because I really think that's important. And that point that you raised was what I see as the holding the hope and the vision and the opportunity. And to hold also people's realities and to really listen and think carefully with intention about how we can partner going forward. With that in mind, I do just want to honor two people real quick. One is someone who's not with us, Betty Tableman, who was a real hero of mine, who was a policy leader around infancy, early childhood families in the infant mental health field. She was in the 70s. The director of prevention services in what was then the Department of Mental Health in Michigan. And she's in the Michigan, she was inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. And she really worked to embed infant mental health and early childhood mental health services into community mental health. And a partner in making that happen is with us today. And that's Miss Kerry Patterson, who has really done tremendous work. And thank you, Kenyatta, for honoring that. And I just want to honor her and thank her for her presence here with us today. I've had the privilege of working with her and know that she has dedicated part of her life to actualizing career ladders and pathways. In addition to serving families and support, she's really given a lot of thought to how do we support the workforce through reflective practices, through support, and just really want to share that appreciation. So thank you so much for guiding us in this direction. And our next steps are really to take what you've shared and to make sure that those here have access to the distilled version and to repeat it, but also to make this available to others in communities and to really think, I think our charge is to take all of us, what we've heard, and to really think about how we can contribute to, moving forward in these really critical and important directions. So thank you. Thank you for what you've shared with us so generously today. And thank you to everyone who's attended to listen. Just really appreciate your presence here. And I'll pass it over to Allison.
Well, Kate, that was wonderful. I have very little to add, except that I think I will definitely walk away with that idea of communicate, educate, and expose, and the themes that I was drawing out from all this discussion, hopefully will be really fascinating and inspiring to distill into this executive summary that we will distribute after running through with the presenters to make sure that we've represented their words and everything accurately. And I just appreciate these discussions so much. And I think that it can hopefully spark lots of new connections and ways of thinking and ways of reaching out and working with families and workers and children and everyone that we work with. So we thank you all for coming, and we will be in touch. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the day and can get some relaxation. And really just thank you so much to all of the speakers and all of your thoughts and comments. Kate, was there one more thing?
There was. Trisha just shared we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but we have the chat. We're saving the chat. We hope to be able to think about ways to respond to that potentially in the things that we'll distribute. And just so you know, on the note of workforce, our listservs and who we will share the executive summary with includes, well over 1,000 early care and education providers across the state. Like, we will really work hard to share what you've shared with us, with folks in communities, and welcome your input in helping us think about ways to do that as well. So thank you.